representing Canada's financial capital, the fourth largest city in North America, and the most amazing city in the world. This is Toronto Business Journal.
Hello everyone, we're here for another fantastic and amazing edition of the Toronto Business Journal. We have an absolutely spectacular guest today, Mr. Ewan Wardle, to talk about the War of 1812, particularly in the strange times we're in right now about the alleged desire to annex Canada. So we thought we would go back, different time a little bit, and talk about the War of 1812 with Mr. Wardle. Take it away, Santosh.
Ewan Wardle is a Program Development Officer at Fort York National Historic Site in Toronto. Over the past 25 years, he has served in various roles at the museum and has delivered a wide variety of programming about Fort York and its place in our nation's history. In 2013, he received the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal in recognition of his contributions to Fort York. His lifelong interest in early 19th century British military history has also led to a long-standing involvement in War of 1812 reenacting. He currently lives in Oakville, Ontario, with his wife and 2 children. Thank you so much, Mr. Wardle, for joining us on the program today.
You're very welcome, and thank you for inviting me.
No problem.
Awesome. So thank you very much, Mr. Wardle, again. Reason for our guests, I wanted to introduce you to our viewers out there. Reason which I definitely wanted to reach out to you, Mr. Wardle, is that, it's been like since we've, as Canadians, we've been facing kind of a strange times with what first turned out to a joke is becoming more and more serious, it seems, with the relatively newly elected or re-elected President Donald Trump talking about his desire to use economic coercion to annex Canada. And a lot of us as Canadians have been, first thought it was a joke, including our Prime Minister, taking this a little bit more serious with the announced trade threat to push us in submission to become a so-called 51st state. So I wanted to reach out to you because, with that in mind, it's like since this whole, ongoing 51st state sort of, stuff has been going on, it's like the spirits of the War of 1812 have been knocking at my door and said, hey, wake up, reach out, you got to talk about this, reach out to Mr. Wardle and get his insight on this, because for myself, I don't know a lot of Canadians how they've been in a sense of trepidation, but myself, I just find it, that is very serious, like this, it's like we have a world leader who's drawing maps with Canada and the United States. So I wanted to get your sense, Mr. Wardle, on to start off with, what was the mood like before the War of 1812 began? I know that when I've looked at the literature, there's a certain groups of historians who discussed that, that James Madison, president at the time, just wanted to, get into Canada in order to use it as some bargaining chip in some trade negotiation. Other historians think it was still part of the Manifest Destiny plan. So could you give us a sense, Mr. Wardle, of the mood in the United States which led up to the War of 1812 and any sort of parallelisms you see? Was Canadians nonchalant, or were they never going to invade us? What was your sense of the mood before the War of 1812 and both sides of the border?
So first off, I'm going to kind of read a little bit from notes to help with this, but essentially the War of 1812 would not have happened if it wasn't for sort of unresolved issues coming out of the American War of Independence. You had increasing tensions between the United Kingdom and the United States, beginning in the early 1800s, especially. And these were largely stemming from the outcome of the American War of Independence. It can be argued that the War of 1812 was, in fact, only a continuation in some respects of that earlier conflict. Essentially, you had the affirmation of one group of an identity appropriate to a young nation, USA, confronting the humiliation of another who still had not accepted the outcome and consequences of defeat. I'm quoting a historian now. So you had America, a young, brash nation trying to put itself on the national stage, as it were, and United Kingdom, who hadn't gotten over the humiliating defeat that they suffered from the American War of Independence. Now, at the same time, you can't take the War of 1812 out of sort of the global context of what was going on, and that was the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. This global conflict essentially exacerbated existing tensions between the United States and the United Kingdom. And you can say that if it wasn't for the Napoleonic Wars, the War of 1812, as we know it, likely would not have occurred. So I'll get into those issues in a moment, but let me start with some of the unresolved issues. So in the case of the United States, again, you're looking at a young nation. You're looking at a nation that was striving for its place. And the years leading up to the War of 1812, you saw, in essence, the first post-revolutionary generation coming of age. So you had the founding fathers generation, the generation that fought and secured the United States' independence. And now you have this next generation of young men coming into politics, who will some of them not even born at the time of the revolution. So they were comparing themselves to the men who came before them, and they were using these ongoing existing issues with the United Kingdom as their opportunity to show their patriotism, their nationalism, their love for nation. And so in essence, these brash young politicians who were referred to as the war hawks were drumming up a base, if you will. We're trying to get people to be overly patriotic, overly nationalistic, as a way of showing their pride and love of nation, and propel America into yet another conflict with the United Kingdom, as a way of showing that they could live up to their forefathers, that they could live up to the men who came before. So going back to the Napoleonic War aspects, there's three big reasons that the Americans gave for why they declared war on the United Kingdom. And all these issues weren't new in 1812. These had been going on for a little while. First was that as a young nation, in order to be economically viable, it needed to conduct international trade. And so the United States was very much a maritime power and was trading with European states and their colonies. But the Napoleonic Wars put all that in jeopardy. You see, in order to fight each other, both the British and their allies and the French and their allies were imposing economic blockades on each other. The Americans were a neutral nation. They weren't involved in the Napoleonic Wars, and they felt as a neutral nation they should be entitled to free trade. That they should not be their vessels, their trading ships should not be impeded by these blockades that were being imposed by the warring parties. But nevertheless, of course, America was being affected by these blockades. So American ships, for example, weren't able to trade directly with French ports or ports under French control. In order to trade with the French, essentially they either had to run the British blockade, or they would have to pay the British essentially a stipend. They'd have to give the British a little bit of money in order to have the privilege to trade with the French. And the Americans took great offense to this. Again, it's not our war. We're not involved in this war. Why should we suffer economically, materially by these warring parties? Another issue for the Americans were British were not only preventing the Americans from trading directly with the French, say, the British were also stopping American ships on the high seas and boarding these vessels and searching on board these vessels for deserted British sailors. So the Royal Navy, the British Navy, in order to be the powerful Navy that it was, needed tens of thousands of sailors. And of course, not everyone wanted to be in the British Navy. Not everyone wanted to be a sailor in the British Navy. And so many of whom who chose not to be in the British Navy, many of them deserted. They ran away. And where better place to go than a country that spoke the same language, had a similar cultural and shared heritage. So it is true that many British sailors who deserted from the Royal Navy found sanctuary on American ships and in the United States. But when the British were stopping these American ships under the justification to search for deserted British sailors, the British Navy officers weren't being too discriminating. They were sometimes forcing American sailors who might have had no connection whatsoever with the British Navy into the British Navy, forcing them, essentially kidnapping them off American ships. And so for the United States, this was yet another great affront. You had, the argument was you had American citizens being kidnapped and forced to fight in a foreign war. And so for the American people, this was a huge offense. This was a huge affront, and this exacerbated the relations with the British. And then the last reason that the Americans were getting upset at the British at this time was that America was not only growing economically through international trade, but was also growing territorially. It was expanding west into the lands of indigenous peoples. Many of these indigenous peoples had long-standing relations, treaty relations with the British, who were based out of Canada. So for the Americans, as they were expanding westward and began to face opposition from indigenous peoples defending their ancestral homeland, the Americans felt, well, the best way to deal with these native peoples is to cut off their supplies of arms and munitions that was coming from the British in Canada. So for the Americans, the best way to deal with indigenous resistance on the frontier was to remove the British from Canada, who they felt were supporting the natives materially, and for the Americans too, they felt that the British were essentially inciting the natives to resist settler expansion. So I'm going on a long tangent.
That's okay. That's okay.
Very detailed. I like that.
So as you mentioned about territorial expansion, is it safe to say that Manifest Destiny, which has been a part of a certain ideological psyche of the United States, that Manifest Destiny was a part of the driving force of the War of 1812 as far as the incursions into Canada? Is that fair to say?
Well, so Manifest Destiny as a term was not coined until later in the 19th century, so well after the War of 1812. There are those who try to retroactively kind of put that same mindset, that same philosophy into the time of the War of 1812. But I wouldn't say but. I would actually say that that same idea of America's destiny to control a continent was part of the motivation for the Americans. I would agree with that. I wouldn't necessarily personally use the term Manifest Destiny, only because it is a later term, but the American desire to control their frontiers, to suppress indigenous peoples that were residing on the frontiers of the United States in their traditional territories. For the Americans to achieve those ends, they had to drive the British from Canada. And so, in order for America to expand, it needed to deal. At the time, they felt they needed to deal with the British in Canada once and for all.
With that in mind, and one thing which I think that many Canadians are not necessarily critically aware of is that this idea of an undefended border was something that came a lot later than the War of 1812. The War of 1812, my understanding that During that time, there were a certain amount of Canadian and British and Indigenous military positions, which were there, including on Lake Ontario, in order to rebel and repel when actually there was a sort of a military incursion into Canada. So with that in mind, it's one of the things which I think that Canadians have been concerned of is we seem to have south of the border a president who is talking as if he has been teleported from, centuries ago and is renewing this idea of territorial expansion.
Very brash as well.
Yeah, he talks about the need to expand before, expand the United States into new, beautiful horizons, which sounds like Canada. He has his photo of which is really the Swiss Matterhorn, but he has this photo gazing at Canada. Canada should become a 51st state. We're going to coerce Canada into joining the United States and stuff like that. How do you think, it's all speculation, but how would somebody from that era of 1812 react in terms of if they were teleported here? How would they might theoretically react? Would they say, there's nothing to worry about? Would they be paranoid? I'm just sort of getting a historical perspective, because my understanding, one phrase which I sort of like is those who ignore the lessons of history are doomed to repeat it. So is there any sort of lessons that we can learn from history in terms of how we can deal with a president which is talking about territorial expansion against us in light of our experience with what happened in the War of 1812?
Well, the thing to keep in mind in going to the War of 1812 specifically is that kind of what I was driving at before behind the reasons for that war. You didn't have the history of peaceful coexistence and what's the other word I'm looking for, and longstanding alliance structures that we today have with the United States. So like at the time of the War of 1812, although Americans and British prior to the war obviously conducted commerce with each other, you didn't have any alliance connecting the two powers. You had long-standing animosity, as I was touching on before, coming out of the American War of Independence. You had a global environment created by the Napoleonic Wars that exacerbated existing relations between the Americans and the United Kingdom. All these things don't exist today. So the thing is, Trump's, how could I say it? Trump's rhetoric right now is very different from what we've grown accustomed to coming from the President of the United States. But I think it would be very difficult to draw direct parallels with the lead up to the War of 1812, again, because the geopolitical world of today and our relations, Canada's relations with the United States today, is very different from what you would have seen in the 19th century. I mean, one of the big things to keep in mind is, of course, that Canada as an independent entity on the North American continent didn't exist in 1812. That in one of the big reasons why the war even happened was we were a British part of the British Empire. We were a collection of British colonies. We didn't have our own means of making international relations. You got to remember that for people living in what's now Ontario and people living in what's now, say, New York, that the border, as we know it today, was a lot looser back then. That you had people who had relatives on either side of the border, as we do today. But I mean, you had a far more fluid intermixing of peoples back then, and so for the settlers here in Ontario and for those living in New York, there was a lot more commonality. There was a lot more reasons for them to be friends than enemies. What essentially allowed relations to deteriorate was in part because we were British. We were part of the British Empire, like I said, and so consequently, the people living in what's now Canada had very little say on how to resolve and address the issues that were existing between the British and the Americans. Today, of course, we have our own means of working with other international parties and speaking truly for the people of this country. And I'm really hoping that Trump's rhetoric is just that, and that people can actually get past that rhetoric and hopefully find commonality and common ground to allow our two nations to continue to enjoy the economic and social benefits that we've had for so many years now. Trump's rhetoric about the trade deficit, it's not even accurate. So I'm going off history for a moment. So I'm really hoping that calmer minds will prevail, and that Trump's rhetoric hopefully will not deteriorate our very long-standing relations with the United States.
So so definitely. I mean, my understanding is that, as you've said, is that the War of 1812 was a sort of a ongoing exercise of conflict from the American Revolution. It's like unresolved conflicts that kept manifesting that involved France and involved England. So it was basically tensions that kept building between Britain and the United States and involving France, that the War of 1812 sort of manifested from those ongoing military, broader European type of disputes. And then today in our sort of society, we've had pretty much, I kind of read after that War of 1812, Britain made an effort to have a strong rapprochement with the United States as a way of protecting Canada from that happening again and stuff. That's sort of, that sort of scenario of a war with the United States, even though I've seen some strange things on the internet, which may or may not true, that talked about sort of simulated wars between Canada and the United States. I don't know if you know about them, but I've seen that there was up to like the early 20th century, I guess in the time of Wilfrid Laurier, there were sort of simulated potential war scenarios breaking up between Canada and the United States. I don't know if that's some sort of internet rumor or whatever, but definitely.
No, it's true. Sorry to interrupt. It is true. Both the United States and Canada had essentially war plans that if a war was to happen, this is how we're going to fight our neighbor. And these plans were in place right up until the Second World War. So both nations were prepared for the possibility of a renewed conflict right up until the Second World War. But again, as the decades went on following the War of 1812, the chances of that actually ever occurring diminished more and more. And that was in no small part because what you said before with the British realizing that conflict here in North America was not in their interest. And so the British diplomats and politicians, along with the American peers to a certain degree, did a lot to calm tensions if they were to arise, as they did, say, in the late 1830s and 1840s, again in the 1860s. And then again, as Canada grew as a nation and became more autonomous from Britain, we were able to advocate for ourselves in such a way that, again, did much to help ensure that renewed conflict would not occur between the United States and now Canada.
With respect to the one thing which I had a difficulty in getting a sense of is the mood in both sides of the border of the people in general. Was there a sense before the War of 1812, if you went and teleported back into Southern Ontario, which is Upper Canada at that time, or upstate New York, would there be a sense that there's a war about to happen, or was there like disbelief that's never going to happen in terms of the general people going about their business?
Tensions were rising between the United States and Great Britain. There were key hot points, hot flashes over the years leading up to 1812. But I think for many who just wanted to get on with their lives, the war was an unwelcomed, maybe not surprise, but a very unwelcome news. For most of the people living along the border, they were mostly rural, agricultural. They were mostly farmers. Their concern was harvest, right? And this conflict was the last thing they needed, because many of them, many who were older, would know the dangers and horrors associated with frontier warfare back then. And we got to remember that what's now Southern Ontario was the frontier. That if you're old enough to remember the American War of Independence, you would know how terrifying and difficult war was. So again, I think for most people, they didn't want this forced upon them. And what you do find a lot is apathy, maybe is a good word to say. Like a lot of people just wanted to stay out of it. And until their hands were forced, often by their own governments, most people were happy to just stay out of it and let the armies do the fighting, and hopefully the armies come nowhere close to their farm. So, case in point, when the Americans successfully captured York, what's now Toronto, in April of 1813, any of the militiamen who would remain behind in the town would be expected to sign a parole. This meant that they weren't going to be taken as a prisoner of war in the United States or anything, but the parole basically meant that they were promising not to pick up arms against the Americans until released from their parole. And what's very interesting is you didn't only have the local militiamen who rallied on the day of the battle to defend the town, signing these paroles. For days afterwards, you had people coming in signing these paroles because they knew that they were legally bound by signing that parole not to do militia duty, not to serve in the defense of Upper Canada. So they could focus on their farms, they could focus on their families, and not have to worry about being called up to do militia duty. So it gives you a sense that for many people, again, this war was very unwanted, and they would just prefer their lives to be left alone by the warring parties, if that makes any sense.
And was the president back then, was he like kind of pushing for the war, like the American president?
James Madison, yeah.
James Madison, yeah. How was he like? Yeah.
So the Madison was part of the what was then the Democratic Republican Party, and that was the pro-war party. So the Democratic Republicans, they very much favored war as a way of addressing what they felt were the wrongs committed upon the United States by Great Britain. And so, although Madison wasn't necessarily the loudest advocate for war, he was definitely knew that he had to work with those younger politicians, those war hawks that I was talking about before, in order to stay in power, in order to remain not only the head of the party but also the head of the government, to remain the president. So Madison, his rhetoric, I wouldn't say was as how best to put it. He was a very different man than President Trump. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
But from what I understand, he was more. He wasn't so much leading the charge as he was following the direction that his party was going, and knowing that he needed to work with those politicians, work with those more bellicose members of his party in order to stay in power, in order to remain the president.
Yeah, because James Madison was definitely, he was one of the founders of the American Constitution. So he had been committed to constitutional values. But one of the, and I'm looking for your insight too, Mr. Wardle, one of the ideological strains, which I seem to have noticed in the War of 1812, which manifested as well when the Americans went to take over Windsor, was that this idea that we're coming to free you from the British and we're liberators. And I'm hearing this sort of rhetoric again with Trump and his son when he went to Greenland. We're going to free you. We're going to make you a state. This is the thing which I'm sort of getting very uneasy about, that not only is this idea of we're going to annex you, but the same sort of ideological rhetoric that, oh, you Canadians, you're with Britain and we're liberators and we're going to liberate you, when it has the pretext of resources. So what was the was that a definitely a strain going on in the War of 1812? We're coming to free these in our sort of free you subjects of Britain, and we're going to make you part of the United States, and you're going to be just like us. Was that how much was that rhetoric and ideology part of the zeal of the soldiers, whoever the sort of the ideological driving force of the War of 1812?
So that was a factor. You see it more at the beginning of the war, when there was a belief, quite frankly, on both sides of the border, that settlers here in Canada would not defend themselves and would gladly kind of let the Americans walk right in. But that rhetoric is kind of part of America's founding. This idea that we are a republic. We are a nation of the people, for the people, by the people. So, why wouldn't the subjects of the terrible British Crown want to be freed and embraced in our democratic republic? So that the American rhetoric in the war was kind of playing to what was already sort of a part of its established mythos as a state of free men. But again, whether the common soldiers felt that way, yeah, you had some more ideological driven individuals, but at the end of the day, the common person, if they were in the uniform, many of them were joining the army for social economic reasons, not because of high ideals and rhetoric, right? So it's one thing for the politicians and generals to be talking about freeing Canadians from the tyranny of the crown. It's another thing completely to think of it for the common soldiers, right? And again, as the war went on, and as the Americans faced stiffer opposition than they anticipated, that rhetoric kind of died away, because for the Americans, they realized that, oh no, that this is going to be a bit of a harder fight than anticipated, and the British played up that fact, that they really tried to play up the loyalist factor, that their Canadian subjects were loyal to the crown and willing to fight to defend their homes, and so British politicians, British generals began to play up that sort of the counter to that American idea of liberation. But yeah, it is kind of funny how, going from the American Revolution, War of 1812, and all the way up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, you have this consistent rhetoric of like, we're liberating you. It is
seems to be our running theme.
So wasn't that one of the I was reading like your comments, Mr. Wardle, that one of the big miscalculation by President Madison in the United States was that he thought that the Americans that came to Canada were going to help the American so-called liberators, but in fact they took up arms with the Canadians. It was not one of the big factors that surprised the Americans, that the Americans who came here and settled actually helped to defend Canada?
Yeah, well, we have to remember that here in Upper Canada, at the time the war began, the vast majority of the settler population were recent immigrants from the United States. And they didn't come to Canada because of any sense of loyalty to the crown. You did have loyalists and the descendants of loyalists from the American Revolution living here. But the vast majority of the settlers had come here well after the Revolution. They came here because the land was cheap and taxes were low. They came here for economic reasons and to make a better life for themselves here than what they felt they could do in New York or Pennsylvania. But you're quite right that although this population was expected to be less resistant to the Americans, both the British officials and American politicians assumed that these people would just let the Americans walk right in. There was enough of them who were willing to support the crown, were willing to support British interests, that it definitely helped preserve British Canada, so to speak. The big thing to keep in mind is that this population, again, if they could be left alone, they would have been happy, right? The War of 1812, the fighting that occurred in that conflict meant they couldn't be left alone. That areas that came under American occupation, areas that witnessed heavy fighting, and saw a lot of economic devastation. So you might have had somebody, in 1812, say, who was happy enough to just let the Americans pass on through his village. But by late 1814, after nearly 3 years of fighting, seeing American soldiers, burning his fence for firewood, killing his livestock for food, this guy's tired of Americans now. and these people began to feel less affinity towards their American cousins. And funnily enough, actually, arguably, the more expansive and inclusive Canadian identity that we have today came out in part from the experiences of these early Upper Canadian settlers. You see, I'm going to go on a tangent, forgive me. You see, in 1812, if you were to call somebody a Canadian, you would have been referring to a French-speaking Catholic of French heritage. You would have been speaking to someone who we today would maybe call a Quebecois, right? They were the Canadian. These white settlers living in Upper Canada from the United States, they still identified themselves as American. Or even they identified themselves by the states that they might have came from, like New York or Pennsylvania. But the War of 1812 would change this. These people began to have to reassess their identity because of this conflict with the United States. And they weren't British. So what were they? Well, they began to self-identify and be identified as Canadians. And so what had traditionally been a term that was very centered around one's ethnicity, French, one's faith, Catholic, one's language, French, was beginning to expand to become more inclusive, and that English-speaking Protestants of ultimately, say, British ancestry could start to identify as Canadian. And that process, you could say, has carried on right to the modern day. That Canadian identity has continued to expand and become more inclusive. But that process arguably started out of the War of 1812 and started from these American settlers of what's now Ontario.
Yeah, so that's why I was reading. For the Americans, it became the outcome of the War of 1812 was some refer to as the Second War of Independence, but in Canada, it really helped to bring together and consolidate the sense of Canadianness across these different cultural communities, which before were disparate, with the Anglos and the Americans and the British and the French and the indigenous communities. So kind of forged the forging of that sort of who we are as Canadians, that sort of Canadianness.
Yeah, so you have that a settler population who began to identify as Canadian. You also had British officials who were now limiting any future American immigrants from moving in to British Canada, and you had a lot more sort of top-down British propaganda to try to create a sense of very Anglo identity, or very distinctly British identity here. And so for the War of 1812, the conflict became part of our mythos, became part of our story. As you said, the Americans feel the War of 1812 sometimes is the Second War of Independence. Well, you can say the War of 1812 was our War of Independence, but from the United States. And that mythology began to be cemented in the decades following the War of 1812, and did a lot to give, as you were saying, a sense of common identity that was distinct and uniquely Canadian. And because, like, quite literally half of Canada is now what's now Ontario, this process began in what's now Ontario, and then as people here in Ontario began to immigrate west into the western provinces, etc., this idea began to be supported with.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So one of the things I wanted to also ask you about, Mr. Wardle, is my concern definitely about, honoring the legacy of all, because, as a lot of us know about read about the War of 1812, how bloody it was, how much sacrifice there was from the Canadian side. Defending Canada from the attack of the Americans at all different levels under incredible odds. So one of the insights which I wanted to get from you, Mr. Wardle, today, in terms of honoring the memory of 1812 beyond just simply the mystique and how we were able to save ourselves from the American attack, is when we hear, for example, U.S. President Trump talking about these things like, Canada-U.S., just the artificial border, become the 51st state, economically coerce us, and all these sort of, we draw the maps very blatantly, like I've never seen a world leader would draw maps like that, but apart from, Mr. You might have a lot more insight than me, but when I, studied World War II, that's what Hitler used to do before he invaded countries. He said, we need living room, Lebensraum, and he started withdrawing maps, and, and that was a prelude to military invasion. So one of the things which I want to ask you is that, we have a transition between a president of the United States, President Biden, which was part of the continuity of honoring the peaceful relations that we have enjoyed with the United States in terms of friendly trade and prospering together on the continent as two sovereign nations. In order to honor the legacy of the War of 1812, since we now have a president that started to use sort of 19th century belligerence, as if we're just coming out of the American Revolution, as if we're still in the midst of the 19th century, is it perhaps important that Canadians adjust their thinking, that we no longer have a President Clinton or a President Biden or all these other presidents that were part of our welcoming to Canada and this welcome? Do we need to adapt a 19th century thinking to a president who is talking as if he's in the 19th century? Is this president who seems to have teleported his brain in the 19th century thinking? Is he talking this way from a 19th century perspective because he sees Canada as a vulnerable military target that we as Canadians, who needing to adjust our thinking, need to start to think about how we can no longer be naive, that we can no longer be in a military vulnerable position, do we need to adjust that thing? Because from my sense, we have an undefended border, how can we cannot, if we honor the legacy of the War of 1812, we can, for myself, we cannot simply assume, he's just joking, ha 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 ha. Do we have to now take a 19th century, go back and start looking as if we're just emerging from the 19th century? Do we need to adjust that? Do we need to adjust our military defense posturing to make sure that we are in a position to thwart any efforts to capitalize on our military vulnerabilities. Just wanted to get your perspective on that from a historian perspective.
I would say that the best thing, Canadians who are concerned by what they're hearing today from President Trump need to advocate towards their politicians, be they provincial or more importantly federal, to not be complacent in our dealings with the United States, to not rest on our laurels, so to speak. That we need to be proactive in selling to Americans the unique and distinct advantages that they have when it comes to our relation. You know, like one of the things that I think Trump has to his advantage is because he will come out with some very bold and ridiculous statements. People don't know how to react, right? People don't know how to react properly to it. So what we need are politicians who can deal with that kind of bellicose rhetoric and remind Americans that he's full of shit, so to speak. Excuse my language. Sorry, it's supposed to be a family show. You know, again, I think for Canadian politicians, from our Prime Minister and other federal ministers to our premiers and our provincial ministers, they need to speak truth to power, so to speak. They need to tell Americans again all the things that all the benefits that come from our relationship, economically, socially, militarily, and get Americans to realize how important and unique this relationship is, and how, again, full of shit Trump is by trying to rock the boat with this silly rhetoric of his. Again, so many of the things that he is saying about Canada in relations to trade deficits, in relations to defense spending, et cetera, are at the very best half-truths. And most of them are just lies. So we need to call out his BS. And the only way for Canadians to do that successfully is to put their politicians' feet to the fire and get their politicians to speak to boldly to all the things that we are doing that are to the benefit of not only ourselves but to our American brothers and sisters, and not let media personalities dominate the conversation. Buddy, what's his name from Shark Tank? Forgive me, his name escapes me right now. Leary?
Yeah.
Like, no.
Kevin O'Leary.
Kevin
O'Leary.
Kevin, yeah. I'm sorry. We don't need reality show
hyping it all up.
figures. Getting interviews on CNN and Fox News and stuff. No, it should be our finance ministers. It should be our prime minister. We have politicians for a reason, and they should be the ones that are on the airwaves, both Canadian and American shows, and again supporting, propping up what we do and how important our relationship is with the United States.
With that said, Mr. Wall, one of the things I think which is definitely seems to further fueling the rise of anxiety is when, for example, U.S. President Trump, in violation of trade agreements and in the rule of international law, is not ruling out even military force against Greenland, and he does have the executive capacity to orders, from my understanding, some type of, military invasion if he sees fit. We see the United States, has already started wars without getting any sort of congressional endorsement. So my, question to you in terms of, getting your insight is that in Canada, as a ongoing member of the Commonwealth, we do continue to have a head of state who is, King Charles III. As Canadians, do we need to, in order to try to help diffuse this rhetoric, apart from the diplomacy which is going on, do we need to start thinking about leaning on our traditional, historical Canadian-British alliance, which saved us once before on the War of 1812? If it was not for Britain, we would not be able to have survived that conflict. Do we need to start looking at Britain once again in order to give us a stronger sense of authority when dealing with Trump? Because my appreciation of President Trump is that he likes to deal with his from adversaries. He respects people with power. People like Putin, President of China, anybody that seems to have military power. He seems to treat them with respect. Anybody he sees as vulnerable, he treats them accordingly. And the more you try to appease him, the more he tries to dominate you. So appeasing him does not seem to work. He seems to prefer to deal with people from authority. So as far as learning from the lessons of, War of 1812, I mean, Britain is not in a position as though we were in 1812 in terms of being divested in a conflict abroad. Would a leaning on the British sort of, historical political association, do you think that would have a positive or negative benefit in terms of us seeking to, diffuse this sort of Trump trying to pick on what he may see as military weakness in order to potentially exploit potential surprise attacks?
It isn't necessarily leaning on the British per se, as it is working with the international community and the international alliance networks that we are a part of. So at the very least, and it's not the least, it's quite important, we are one of the founding members of NATO, as is Denmark for that matter. So for the United States to unilaterally break that long-standing treaty organization by attacking one of its members, the good news is that that alliance network is there to make sure that doesn't happen, so to speak. So again, I think for Canadians, if we are concerned that we have, say, a rogue president who will do even more than he did in his first time in office to upset prior international norms, that we need to then lean on those international bodies that we are part of. And in a military sense, NATO is it, right? It is an alliance network that has been in place since 1949. And we have had long-standing relations, military relations with all the member states of NATO. Obviously, NATO is as powerful an international alliance network as it is because of the United States. And that's why I ultimately don't think America will conduct any military actions towards Denmark, because they wouldn't want to risk breaking that alliance network. But again, that alliance network and the relations that we have with the member nations should give Canadians that peace of mind, that sense of security, which again was not really in place, say, at the time of the War of 1812. We were a British colony at the frontier of empire in 1812, and also in 1812, Britain was very much alone. Napoleon, up until that point, was winning in Europe, right? He controlled most of the continent and was poised to invade Russia in 1812. So, like, unlike in 1812, where we are an appendage of the British Empire, and Britain was kind of on its own, we are not on our own. We are a strong, vibrant nation with although it doesn't feel it at times, a comparatively strong economy, and we are part of a number of international bodies that help ensure our peace and security in the international world.
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, for me, what you said and stuff is definitely, Mr. Wardle, what our most, civilized members of the civilized world would think. That's what, most of us would like to think. So, but with that said, my concern definitely is that I don't think that U.S. President Trump is thinking like most people. I don't think he's acting normally. He definitely campaigned on a sense of peace, a sense of putting food on the table, a sense of his whole first term was about not starting any war. And as soon as he comes off the gate, from his, he's all of a sudden talking about invading Panama. He's talking about not ruling out invading Greenland. He's talking about coercing. This is a different mentality that we see seem to be. What you were going to say, Santos?
Oh, no, I think there's something happening behind the scenes. Well, it's not just him. It's like maybe like people are like advising him in certain different direction. I don't know. Or maybe America feels their economy is not. It's stagnant and they need to do something.
For example, if we look at, for example, let's say Taiwan, for example, I mean, Taiwan has had this tension for a long time with China, but the Taiwanese, what they do is that they have built up a strong military infrastructure to show the Chinese that, well, if you're going to try to take us over, then you're going to have a battle, and maybe you don't want to go through that bloody exercise of trying to take us over. So if we look at these parts of the world where there's been an effort to, this whole talk about we're going to annex you or whatever and stuff like that, they seem to have been a pattern of military deterrence as part of an international diplomacy. So my concern is that from the standpoint of the War of 1812, are we overly relying on international diplomacy and not sufficiently trying to realize that we're in a more of a hostile world, particularly when our sovereignty is being openly attacked on a daily basis? Do we need to start to rely on our armed forces and deterrence in the same way that Taiwan has sought to rely on their armed forces with also the protections of the civilized world in terms of international diplomacy?
So the thing to keep in mind, though, is that Canada's military is so heavily integrated in with the United States' military. I mean, our two nations have been working in a defensive partnership and alliance since the Second World War. So if what we're seeing today from Trump is an indication that 80-plus-year-old relationship is coming to an end, then we are in a whole new, it's a complete change on how we approach defense, how we approach our military affairs. And that's like a whole other conversation, because again, our two militaries, Canada's and the United States, is so heavily integrated. The down to the very ammunition that our soldiers use is to ensure that there is a consistent logistics chain, right? Because so much arms and munitions come from American manufacturers, right? So it's just one of these things that, like, unlike Taiwan, which has been effectively independent from the People's Republic of China since 1949, and could very much do its own things separate from China out of necessity, but also out of its security needs. We have been so integrated with the United States that if we were to try to do something like, say, Taiwan and have a strong military to defend us from the Americans, we would have to sort of divorce ourselves from that long-standing military relationship that we've had. And I don't think we really can grasp how, not only how expensive, but how difficult that transition will be. And I'm really hoping that at the end of the day, Trump is such a narcissist and ultimately just wants to be liked, that what we're seeing today is just rhetoric. That talk is cheap, right? That if he I don't want to diminish the craziness of some of his statements. I don't want to downplay it necessarily, but like the fact that the idea that we would that he would maybe act on any of his statements, I think I don't think we're there yet. And again, if we will to create a military structure that was so divorced from the American military and logistics that we've come to rely on, it would be, in many respects, this would be a very different Canada. Like we would be again, when you think of countries like Taiwan, or I hate to use the example necessarily because getting into the controversy there, but like Israel or something, their military budgets, their military spending is huge compared to Canada because of who their neighbors are. And we as Canadians have fortunately not had to worry about that because we have had such good relations with Americans since at least the middle of the 20th century, and now obviously beginning that much further back. Furthermore, I think we as Canadians can do a lot to work with our cousins south of the border to ensure that we don't the kind of environment that exists, say, between the People's Republic of China and Taiwan would never develop here. Like, we can work with our brothers and sisters south of the border. We can work with like-minded politicians who are sensible and reasonable to ensure that our two nations don't go down that dark path that would warrant the necessity of ramping up, our military. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, definitely, it would be good that we don't get to that sense. It'd be definitely be good to continue to have the peaceful relations about two, mutually respecting sovereign nations engaging in trade and, pursuing prosperity on their own terms. Definitely, I think that's an ideal that Canadians and Americans as two sovereign nations and peoples, I think that's what is desirable and stuff. That's all what we would like and stuff like that. It's just unfortunate that we've perhaps reached to a stage where we're having to question that when we have a U.S. president who's on a daily basis. I mean, he went into Davos repeating 51st state, and all this other kind of stuff. It's been, we've just been dealing with a daily barrage coming from Trump.
I think so. It's just, sorry to interrupt you, but I think when it comes to what Trump is saying and what Trump is doing, like, if you want to look at it from a sort of a soft power approach, is he knows that there are plenty of Canadians, unfortunately, who support sort of his agenda. And I think what he's trying to create is he's essentially trying to empower those Canadians to elevate our own version of Trump, so to speak, or to elevate a politician or political party that would be more in line with Trump and what Trump wants for America. So, like, at the end of the day, I think if you had a politician right now, instead of Prime Minister Trudeau and the Liberal Party, if you had a Neville Leto in power right now, who was more of like minds with Trump, I don't think you would be hearing the rhetoric that you're hearing right now. Let's put it that way. I think Trump is doing it in part because he knows it can potentially bring about a change in the political climate here in Canada that would be advantageous to the United States from his perspective.
Well, definitely, I think that's what his objective is, to Mr. Wardle, what you're saying. But I think that when he makes, for example, comments that Wayne Gretzky should be prime minister, I think that is a strong level of ignorance. I think, for example, when, I think there's a lot of Americans, particularly when Target expanded into Canada, they thought that, well, it's just going to be, we're just north, we're another version of Americans, it's going to be a piece of cake, and they end up going bankrupt. I think lots of Americans, I used to hear them, a while back, think that, well, Canada is just a big version of Minnesota. So I think that I think President Trump is driven by a lack of understanding of Canadians. He thinks that definitely what you said, that they're, for example, he started off his rhetoric saying, oh, most Canadians support him. Most Canadians would love to join the United States. And he thinks that, and I don't think his actual desire is to make Canada a 51st state. I think his actual desire is to make Canada more like Puerto Rico, to make Canada a colony where it doesn't have statehood, but American corporations and the American political, military, industrial complex can exploit it at will with actually no sovereign control, like what happens in Puerto Rico when they have minimum political representation, but the American federal government has complete control, including the military. So I definitely think there's a lot of ignorance, and I think that President Trump has ended up, to his potential chagrin, he's uniting people together. I mean, there's still a relatively, the last poll I heard is that 90% of Canadians were against the idea of a 51st state. And the reason why we talk about it is the interviews that the War of 1812 have been a part of has resurfaced in the national dialogue as part of our sort of sense of independence that we've been talking about and stuff like that. And I think that he's bringing Canadians together. We have this sort of anti-MAGA hat that, that our premier's been wearing in Ontario, Premier Ford, about Canada's not for sale. So I think he's driven the premiers together. He's creating this unity among a lot of Canadians. I heard like the separatists, for example, they were supporting a consolidated approach against tariffs. We see the government of Quebec, supporting this Team Canada. So it's like, we have this coming together in a corresponding way almost that we had when we were talking about War of 1812, Canadians, French, Anglos, and people coming together and solidifying this identity. But my concern, Mr. Wardle, is that when we have the Canadians come together, and when President Trump sees that Canadians are coming together, this idea that he's just going to talk, and all this fan support he's going to get, that does not materialize. If he does not get the Canada simply capitulating and Canadians actually come together in response to his constant rhetoric, do you think that down the line, a military tactic based upon the insight of War 1812, that might be his last card, that he gets frustrated over months and months and months that these Canadians are actually surviving, he's being hit with tariffs by Trudeau. Canada's not capitulating. Canadians are becoming stronger. Do you think that in his mind about expanding into beautiful horizons, like he talked about in his speech, do you think that Trump is somebody I don't think who likes to, he's not somebody who just simply is going to say, oh, well, I'll just forget about that. I think it's fixated in his mind that Canada is going to be part of the United States. Do you think that that's just talk? Do you think that if Canadians continue to resist, do you think that might be his last card? Or do you think that, the international community will just come together and he'll back down? Like, I'm just trying to look at his 19th century, whatever mind he has, and what his ultimate trajectory is based upon somebody, a 19th century thinking of, wanting Canada to merge in his military industrial complex mentality. Just trying to get your insight on that.
Well, first off, I don't even want to think about the possibility of a conflict between our two nations. It's not that I can't imagine it. It's just we are so fortunate in North America to experience the peace and prosperity that we have, and the idea of our two nations going into armed conflict again is not only very sad but extremely frightening for me.
Yep.
Now, in regards to would Trump resort to such an action? I highly doubt it, only because I think it would put in jeopardy. I don't want to say he necessarily has an agenda. His agenda is Trump, right? At the end of the day, I can't help but feel that all this just evolves around, his sort of cult of the personality, his own ego, and I think if he was to risk armed conflict with Canada because of his ego, I think there would be at least a little bit of him realizing that he would be done for afterwards, right? If America could survive it, he at the very least would become an international pariah, and go down in history as he's already going to go down in history as one of the ... But I mean, this sort of, I hear what you're saying about a 19th century approach to international relations, but that sort of gamesmanship, that realpolitik of the 19th and early 20th century, it existed in part because of more powerful nations being able to isolate weaker nations in the international community, and hoping that no one would call their bluff. Case in point, you think of World War II. I'm sorry to invoke Hitler here in this conversation, but think of World War II. Hitler's actions leading up to the Second World War were based in part on a belief that other European powers, specifically France and Britain, would not go to war against Germany to defend the sovereignty of Central and Eastern European countries, right? That ultimately France and Britain are not going to go to war over Poland. Well, guess what? Hitler was wrong. He France and Britain called his bluff. And again, we have created an international world order out of the wreckage and horrors of the Second World War to in ideally prevent that kind of international environment from returning. Now, we know there's been tragic wars and conflicts in too many parts of the world. Many millions of people have suffered. Many hundreds of thousands have died. But when it comes to, say, the developed world, you think of the peace and prosperity that we've seen in Europe since the Second World War. It is in part because of the change in the international order. And I think if Trump was to try to turn back the clock, the big disadvantage he's going to have, tying back into what I was saying earlier, was that the international order is set up in such a way to prevent even a powerful nation like the United States from going 100% rogue, so to speak. And again, I think for Trump, because so much of his actions seem to be based on his ego, I ultimately don't see him pulling the trigger, so to speak. I don't see him. He might be blowing steam out of his ears and may be saying some pretty awful and ridiculous stuff about Canada. But again, talk is cheap. And I think if things were to not go his way, and as you say, Canadians come together, unite together in such a way as to repel his rhetoric, I can't see him going that next step, because it would essentially risk everything he's done for himself, which is the most important part of who he is, right? His self-aggrandizement, making himself as big and as he is. It would put that all in jeopardy.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So thank you very much for your insight on that, Mr. Wardle. So one of the things which I definitely, many years ago, former Prime Minister Harper wanted to have a sort of a commemoration of an elaborate commemoration of the War of 1812, but many people thought that was still close too jingoistic. Do you think that as Canadians we need to find ways of commemorating the War of 1812 more, having more teaching about it, more on TV or movies? Or do you think that, do you have any insight on what we should do so that Canadians are more aware about the War of 1812 and its importance in Canadian history?
I think in general, the more Canadians can do to reflect on and learn about our past, our collective past, the better we can be as a nation. At the end of the day, in order to know where we're going, we need to know where we came from. And the War of 1812 is an important chapter in our nation's history, but is one of many. And I think the more we as Canadians can do to learn about our past, to learn about the highest highs and the lowest lows, the better we will be as a nation, and the better we will be as a people. So I know there was a lot of controversy for some around Harper's commemoration of the War of 1812, but those kind of federally led endeavors to remind Canadians of, again, our collective story it's important. And I think anything we as Canadians can do to learn about our past, even if not on a national stage, then on a community level, learn about your neighborhood, learn about the intimate stories. Talk to your elders, talk to your grandparents. Get those living memories, record those living memories while you can. It's all important on getting a better sense of who we are and what we can be as a people by looking at our past.
That's good advice. That's very good. Yeah.
Awesome. And so, Mr. Wardle, so you're at Fort York, so I guess you continue to give sort of tours. You're an integral part of sort of the reliving the memory of the War of 1812. Would you have any sort of share any sort of ways that people could visit Fort York, or any tours you give, any description you might want to give about the services you're providing there at the museum in order to commemorate the War of 1812 that people could come and visit?
Yeah, so Fort York is open 5 days a week. We're open Wednesday through Sunday. And at this time of year, we're open from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. When the summertime rolls around, so after the Victoria Day weekend, our hours actually expand to 5 p.m. And we offer different types of experiences. If you were to come down to the fort on a random Friday at this time of year, we are generally offering hourly guided tours of some of our restored historic buildings, as well as we generally try to offer historic cooking demonstrations in our restored 1826 mess kitchen. But we also have special events throughout the year. So the first big special event commemorating a very important occasion in the War of 1812 is our annual observance of the Battle of York. So on April 27th, we'll be commemorating the Battle of York, which occurred on April 27th, 1813. We'll be offering special tours and programming that day. We also will be having other big events throughout the year. So I recommend checking us out online, the city social media, the Fort York Fort York's official City of Toronto website if you'd like to learn more about what's happening. And most important of all, we're free right now. So, if you are budget conscious, but you want to check out Fort York, no worries there, because right now it's free admission. So you can come down, check out the fort at your leisure. And if you wish to donate something to us, you're welcome to, but there's no admission involved in visiting the fort.
Awesome. So when people come down there, is there some place would they donate online or physically when they come there to donate? Like, how does the donation process work?
We have a donation. We have a donation box in our historic gift shop and our museum store. The Fort York is owned and operated by the City of Toronto. So we are taxpayer funded, but every bit of money that is donated helps support the programming that we do and the activations that we put on throughout the year. So there is a donation box at our museum store.
And you also mentioned food, because I'm a bit of a foodie. Are there food sampling going on of the type of food that people used to cook during the War of 1812? What kind of food demonstrations are those?
So we have staff who almost every day we're open. We'll have staff working in our historic kitchen, and they will be making recipes just as that would have been made in that space. So depending on the day and time of year, you can get a various samplings of some of the types of delectables that the officers of the fort used to enjoy. Just the other day, the guys were making derby cakes, which are like little scones with currants in them. Uh-huh. They're quite yummy, and they're quite good at this time of year. Very, very nice at this time of year. And they're made right on a hot iron griddle over the fire. So they're really nice. So
the derby cakes are like any day of the week, or is that just spontaneous? Like where can one look for not only, absorbing the history of the Fort York, but these derby cakes? Like what time is that? What does that happen at lunchtime during Fort York, or when does that happen?
The guys are working in the kitchen. We start animating the kitchen right from when we open at 11 a.m. And we animate the kitchen right up until basically the end of the day. We'll try to get the food on right away, but sometimes takes a little while. So if you're wanting to ensure that you can enjoy some of the delectables in the historic kitchen, I recommend coming, say, around noontime. By then, enough samples have been made over the file for people to enjoy.
Awesome. So around noontime at Fort York, come down there and then check out the delectables.
Yeah.
Awesome. So thank you very much again, Mr. Wardle. Is there any sort of comments or last or wisdom you wanted to impart on people wanting to appreciate the War of 1812 that we didn't really get to talk about?
All I want to say is I just want to thank you very much to both of you. I thank you for reaching out to me the other day. Forgive me if I've gotten a little long-winded, but it's been a real pleasure speaking with both of you, and I really appreciate the invitation to be on this program and to be able to speak to your audience. It's meant a lot for me to have this avenue to reach out to people and share our story.
It's an honor, sir. Thank you very much.
Any last minute thing you wanted to share as well, Santosh?
It's a good time for Canadians to really unite now. Forget about the provincial differences, unite under one banner. I hope some good will come from this, whatever crazy stuff that Trump has said. And hopefully people will do more, are inspired to learn about our history more, which is, as you mentioned, it's very, very crucial. And also, this is one of my main concern right now is the tariff stuff. Like, will the prices of groceries and stuff go up for a while? So maybe it's a good idea to stock up, essentials if you can. That the economics is the way that they really get the common people, as you mentioned.
Maybe we'll start to buy more Canadian. I hope.
There you go.
Buy more Canadian. We won't have to worry about rising prices. We'll support more local farmers.
Yes.
And have the sense of unity around that's part of the War of 1812. The post-war of 1812 of coming together and sharing a sense of family and an extended family to who we are as Canadians. So thank
Exactly.
you again, Mr. Wardle, for coming out, and I encourage people to check out the Fort York Museum. Check out some delectables there. Check out the amazing work that Mr. Wardle and his team is doing there. Further extend your appreciation of the War of 1812, and as Mr. Wardle told us, inspired us to do is learn about Canada in general, learn about your community, and we can build a stronger nation that way. So thank you very much, Mr. Wardle, for coming out, and we look forward to checking out your museum and all the wonderful work you're doing there.
Thank you again.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Have a great evening, guys.
Have a great evening, Mr. Wardle. And thanks for this has been another edition of Toronto Business Journal.